Hello everyone, and welcome back to Little Nightmare. I'm Michael, and before we begin, I'd like to ask for a little support. Please subscribe, leave a like, and if you do, let me know in the comments where in the world you're listening from. These may seem like small gestures, but they're essential for helping the channel grow and allowing me to keep bringing you these stories every night. Now, lower the volume just a bit, get comfortable, turn off the lights, and let's dive together into tonight's first story. Story 1. The first sound was not a sound at all, but a pressure. A subtle shifting of the air in the dead of night that resolved, after a long and breathless moment, into a faint, repetitive ticking. It was the sound of a clock that had not worked in years, a sound that had no business being there in the small, dark bedroom where Farley lay. Tick, a tiny metallic insect chewing at the silence. Tick. It was inside the walls, or inside his own head. He could not tell. He lay perfectly still. The memory of the dream. The last good memory. The one of Gemma laughing. Her head thrown back, the sun caught in her hair, dissolving like sugar in water, leaving only the bitter residue of the waking world. He reached for the lamp, his fingers fumbling on the cool, smooth base, and the light bloomed, a weak, jaundiced yellow that pushed the shadows into the corners but did not dispel them. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, the floorboards cold and grainy beneath his bare feet. The ticking stopped. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was heavier, more profound, a physical weight on his eardrums. He stood, his body aching with a weariness that had nothing to do with sleep, and shuffled toward the bathroom. He did not turn on the main light. The dim glow from the bedroom was enough to navigate by, to find the sink. He braced his hands on the cool porcelain, head hanging low, and took a deep breath. The air smelled of stale toothpaste and the faint, coppery tang of old pipes. He was afraid to look up. For weeks, a dull, persistent throb had taken root in his temples and forehead, a bone-deep ache the doctors had dismissed as stress, as grief manifesting in the physical self. They had given him pills that did nothing but make him feel hollowed out, a bell with no clapper. He lifted his head. For a full 10 seconds, his mind refused to process the image in the mirror. It was his face, yes. The same tired eyes, the same mouth set in a permanent line of sorrow. But rising from his forehead just above the hairline, curving up and back in a slow, cruel arc, were 2 protrusions. They were the color of old bone, streaked with dark, bloody fissures where they had torn through the skin. They were rough, textured like ancient stone, and they ended in points that seemed sharp enough to draw blood from the very air. Horns. He did not scream. The sound caught in his throat, a dry, rattling thing. He brought a hand up, his fingers trembling, and touched one. The sensation was not his own. It was cold. It was hard. It was utterly, irrevocably there. A part of him. He pressed harder, expecting pain, but felt only a distant, foreign pressure, like touching a piece of furniture. He stumbled back from the sink, his legs giving way, and collapsed against the tiled wall, sliding down to the floor. He squeezed his eyes shut, willing it to be a dream, a final, cruel trick of a fractured mind. But when he opened them, the horns were still there in the reflection, a permanent, monstrous crown. The days that followed were a blur of terror and isolation. He called in sick to his job at the print shop. He disconnected the doorbell and drew all the curtains. He existed in a twilight state, moving from room to room, his head perpetually bowed under the new, terrible weight. The horns ached dully, a constant reminder. He tried to saw at them with a serrated knife, but the pain was immediate and blinding, a white-hot fire that raced along his nerves and left him vomiting on the kitchen floor. He tried to hide them under a large, floppy hat, but the pressure of the fabric against the sensitive bases was unbearable. A week after they appeared, Hunger drove him out. It was late. The sky, a deep, bruised purple. He pulled the hood of his sweatshirt low over his face, the rough fabric scraping against the unnatural growths. The air outside was cool and clean, a shock to his system after the stale atmosphere of his house. He walked the 5 blocks to the all-night convenience store, his shoulders hunched, his gaze fixed on the cracked pavement. The store was brightly lit, a sterile oasis of fluorescence. Old Mrs. Gable was at the register, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, her eyes fixed on a small television playing a game show. Farley kept his head down, moving toward the coolers at the back to grab a loaf of bread and some sliced turkey. As he approached the counter, Mrs. Gable looked up. Her eyes, usually hazy with boredom, sharpened. They did not go to his hidden horns, but to his face. She stared, her mouth slightly agape. "Farley?" she said, her voice a dry rustle. "My God, boy, what happened to you?" He froze, his heart hammering against his ribs. "What do you mean?" She leaned forward, her gaze intense, almost hungry. "It's just, you look different. You look true." She blinked, and a strange confessional tone entered her voice. "My Harold, he died thinking I loved him. I didn't. Not for the last 20 years. I stayed for the house. I hated the sound of his chewing. I was glad when it stopped." She said this not with shame, but with a flat, simple finality, as if stating the weather. Then she blinked again, and the intensity faded. She looked confused. "That'll be $8.50, she mumbled, looking down at the bread as if she'd never seen it before. Farley fumbled the money onto the counter and fled, the bread and turkey forgotten. He ran all the way home, his breath sobbing in his lungs. He locked the door behind him and slid to the floor, his mind reeling. It wasn't just the horns. It was what they did. They pulled the truth out of people, dragged it into the light like a wriggling, ugly thing. He had to know. He had to test it. The next day, he went to see his mother. She lived in a small, tidy house on the other side of town, filled with the scent of lemon polish and regret. She opened the door, her face lighting up with a fragile smile that faltered when she saw him. She didn't mention the hoodie. "Farley, honey, come in. You look pale." He sat on her floral print sofa, his hands clenched between his knees. She bustled about, offering tea, cookies, her words a nervous flutter. He let her talk, watching her. Her eyes kept darting to him, then away, unable to hold his gaze for long. "Mom," he said softly. His voice was a low rumble. The air in the room seemed to thicken, to grow heavy. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall became unnaturally loud. She stopped, a teacup poised in her hand. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and her eyes widened. A tear traced a path through her powder. "Oh, Farley," she whispered. Your head. Tell me something true, Mom." She tried to look away, but she couldn't. It was as if he had hooked her with an invisible line. Her mouth worked soundlessly for a moment. "I was relieved," she whispered, the words torn from her. "When your father left, the fighting was over. The house was quiet. I never told you. I pretended to be heartbroken for you. But I was so relieved." She put a hand over her mouth, her eyes horrified. Why did I say that? He left her weeping softly into her hands, the truth hanging in the air between them, a poison he had drawn from her. He felt sick, powerful, and utterly damned. He sought out his oldest friend, Denham. They had been inseparable since childhood, a trio with Gemma. Denham had been the best man at their wedding. He had held Farley up at the funeral. He was the only one Farley thought he could trust. He found Denham in his garage, tinkering with his motorcycle, his hands black with grease. He was a big man, solid and reliable. When Farley walked in, Pulling back his hood, Denham dropped a wrench. It clattered on the concrete floor, the sound echoing in the cavernous space. Jesus, Farley, what the hell is that? An affliction, Farley said, his voice flat. It makes people tell the truth. Denham took a step back, his face pale. You need a doctor, man. A real one. Tell me about the night Gemma died, Denham. Denham's eyes glazed over. He tried to shake his head, to break the connection. But the power of the horns was a physical force, a pressure in the garage. The smell of oil and gasoline became overpowering. We were fighting, Denham said, the words forced out of him. She was going to leave you. She told me. She was unhappy. So unhappy. He was crying now, tears cutting clean lines through the grime on his cheeks. I told her she was crazy. I told her you were the best thing that ever happened to her. We were on the bridge. It was raining. She was crying. I grabbed her arm. I just wanted her to listen. She pulled away. She slipped. Her foot caught on the railing. It was so fast, she just fell over. It was an accident. The world narrowed to Denham's face, a mask of guilt and terror. The truth was a cold stone in Farley's gut. He had spent a year drowning in grief, blaming himself for not being there, for not seeing her pain. And all along, his best friend had been there. His best friend had been the last one to touch her. You let me think it was my fault, Farley said, his voice barely a whisper. You stood by my side and you let me break. I was scared, Denham sobbed. I was so scared. Farley took a step forward. The horns on his head seemed to thrum with a dark energy. The fluorescent light above them flickered. Is that all? Is that the whole truth, Denham? Denham shook his head, a frantic, desperate motion. No. I loved her too. I always loved her. I was glad you were falling apart. I thought if you were broken, maybe I could finally have a piece of what you had. He collapsed to his knees, his great body shuddering. I'm a monster. Farley looked down at his friend, at the pathetic weeping form on the garage floor. The rage he had expected did not come. Instead, a profound and icy calm settled over him. This was his purpose. This was the reason for the horns. Not to find a culprit, but to expose the rot that lived in every heart, including his own. He had drawn out Denham's truth, but in doing so, he had confirmed his own transformation. He was no longer a grieving husband. He was an instrument of revelation. He left Denham there, broken by his own confession. He walked out into the town, his hood down now. He did not hide. People stared. They pointed. Some crossed the street to avoid him. Others, drawn by the same invisible force that had compelled his mother and Denham, approached him. A city councilman confessed to embezzling public funds. A pious woman admitted to poisoning a neighbor's cat out of spite. A young father whispered his secret hatred for his newborn child. The town's hidden sins poured out, a sewer main bursting open, flooding the streets with a stench of hypocrisy and shame. Farley walked through it all, a dark priest hearing their confessions, his horns a conduit for their filth. He ended up at the bridge, the place where Gemma had left the world. The rain began to fall, a soft, cold drizzle that beaded on the rough surface of his horns. He leaned on the wet railing, looking down at the dark, churning water far below. This was where the last piece of his humanity had died. This was where the horns had begun to grow. He thought of Gemma. Not the idealized memory he had clung to, but the real, complicated, unhappy woman Denham had revealed. He had been so wrapped in his own life, his own quiet dissatisfactions, that he had failed to see the depth of her despair. The truth was, he had failed her long before Denham ever laid a hand on her on this bridge. The horns were not a curse placed upon him. They were a manifestation. They were the physical form of the truth he had refused to see, the grief he had refused to fully feel, the anger he had turned inward. They were his. He had grown them himself. The tension that had coiled within him for a year, that had tightened with the emergence of the horns and the horrifying revelations, began to loosen. There was no one to punish. Denham was already in a prison of his own making. The townspeople would have to live with the truths they had spoken. And he, Farley, was no avenging angel. He was just a man with horns, a living, breathing truth. He stood there for a long time as the rain fell harder, washing the streets, cleansing nothing. The sharp, stabbing fear was gone. The burning need for answers was gone. All that was left was a vast, neutral emptiness. He was a fact, a feature of the landscape. The horns on his head were heavy and permanent, and his. A lone car passed over the bridge, its tires hissing on the wet asphalt. The sound faded into the distance. The rain continued to fall, a soft, steady percussion on the river below, and on the hard, curved surfaces rising from his brow. He did not move. He was part of the night, and the rain, and the quiet, enduring truth of things. Story 2. It began not as a thought, nor as a sound, but as a rhythm. A deep, internal percussion that was not my own. I first felt it in the marrow of my bones, a low and steady thrumming, as I stood at the railing of the Arms Hyperion, watching the ceaseless green-gray expanse of the Atlantic. The vibration seemed to rise from the very heart of the ship, a second pulse running counter to my own frantic heartbeat. I tried to dismiss it as the shudder of the great engines breathing fire and steam somewhere far below. But this was different. This was organic. It had a wet, muscular insistence, a cadence that felt ancient and disobedient, a drum beat from a place before time. I had booked passage on the Hyperion to outrun my own life. My name is Elena, and the past was a creature with hot breath and sharp teeth, always just a step behind me, a failed engagement to a man whose smile was a gash of perfect white teeth, a family name that smelled of dust and mothballs and quiet, desperate ruin. The Hyperion was my gilded cage, my escape pod. She was the newest and most luxurious liner to ever cut the waves, a floating city of polished brass and inlaid mahogany, of crystal chandeliers that scattered light like broken diamonds on carpets so thick they swallowed all sound. For the first few days I wandered her grand halls in a state of muted awe, a ghost among the glittering living. The wealthy passengers were a spectacle unto themselves. Men with voices like rolling thunder discussing stocks and politics. Women draped in silk and the cold glitter of jewels. Their laughter sharp and fragile as glass. They carried their secrets lightly, as if they were just another fashionable accessory. But I saw the cracks. I had a talent for it, honed by a childhood spent reading the silences between my parents' words. Mrs. Albright, the steel heiress, would sometimes stop mid-sentence, her eyes going distant and vacant as if listening for a name called from very far away. Mr. Sterling, the railroad magnate, would compulsively wipe his hands on his trousers, as if trying to clean them of some invisible stain. They were all playing a part, and I could see the frayed edges of their performances. And then there was the sound. At first, it lingered just on the edge of hearing. A resonance I felt more than heard. It was there, in the dead of night, when the ship became a tomb of polished wood and whispered dreams. A note, not from the engines, but from the deep itself. A cello string pulled taut across the abyss. I would lie in my bunk, the fine linens feeling like shrouds, and listen to it seep through the hull. It was a sound that promised nothing, a void given voice. The first true omen came on the third night. I had taken to walking the deserted promenade after midnight, the salt spray a fine mist on my face. The sea was a black mirror, reflecting nothing, not even the countless stars pricking the velvet sky. I saw a figure standing at the railing further down, a man I recognized as one of the junior officers. A boy, really, with a face still soft with youth. He stood perfectly still, staring into the darkness. As I drew closer, I saw that his entire body was trembling, not from cold, but from a profound, bone-deep terror. Tears carved clean paths through the grime on his cheeks. "Can you hear it?" he whispered, his voice raw. He didn't look at me. His eyes remained fixed on the black water. "It's calling. It's been calling since we left port." Before I could answer, the senior officer appeared, his face a mask of stern authority. He took the boy by the arm, his grip firm. "That's enough, Evans. You're unwell." He glanced at me, his eyes devoid of warmth. "The seed plays tricks on the mind, miss. Pay him no heed." But I had heard the truth in the boy's shattered voice. The following days took on a strange, diluted quality. The grandeur of the ship began to feel like a stage set, the opulent meals a pantomime of normalcy. The conversations grew more strained, the laughter more brittle. Whispers began to circulate among the stewards. A word passed furtively in the corridors. Tay, weeping. They spoke of a presence, a cold spot that wandered the lower decks, a sound of soft, hopeless sobbing that came from empty rooms. The crew, those hard-faced men who knew the sea's every mood, grew tense and sullen. They watched the passengers with a new unsettling intensity, as if we were cargo that had begun to spoil. I spent my hours in a state of heightened contemplation, watching the world through a lens of gathering dread. The sunlight on the water seemed too bright, too false. The endless horizon was no longer a promise of a new world, but a lid on a jar. The internal pulse I felt grew stronger, synchronizing with the humming from the deep. It was a call and response, a dreadful liturgy. I began to have waking dreams, flashes of imagery that were not my own. A forest of pale, writhing tendrils in the sunless deep. A pressure, immense and patient, waiting at the edge of a continental shelf. A name, spoken not in a voice, but in a shift of tectonic plates. Leviathan, and in a hand. The disaster did not arrive with a bang, but with a slow, inexorable unraveling. It was a Tuesday afternoon. The sky was a flat, iron gray. The air grew thick and heavy, so humid that your clothes clung to your skin. Every breath felt like swallowing warm broth. The sea became preternaturally calm, a sheet of oily, undulating metal. There was no wind. The great flags on the Hyperion hung limp. The world had been muted. That was when the smell began to permeate the ship. Salt and rust and something else, something profoundly biological, like a vast, open mouth, exhaling from the depths. Panic, when it came, was a quiet, insidious thing. Not a scream, but a slow dawning. The power flickered, died, and returned, but the lights now burned with a sickly, jaundiced glow. The steady thrum of the engines faltered, coughed, and fell silent. The great ship, this triumph of human engineering, was dead in the water. A profound silence descended, broken only by that infernal humming, now louder, a physical pressure in the ears. We were gathered in the grand ballroom, passengers and crew alike, a microcosm of society huddled under the failing crystal lights. The captain, a man who had once exuded unshakable confidence, stood before us, his face ashen. He spoke of a mechanical failure, of efforts underway, but his eyes told a different story. They were the eyes of a man who had seen a crack in the world. Then the lights went out for good, plunging us into a blackness so absolute it felt solid. The screams started then, short and sharp, quickly swallowed by the oppressive dark. And in that darkness, the other sounds began. A wet, dragging sound from the corridors outside, a skittering like many legs on the polished floor, and the weeping, no longer soft, but a chorus of it, rising from all around us, from the walls, from the very air. Someone found a lantern, and its wavering beam cut a swath through the gloom. It illuminated faces frozen in rictuses of terror. It illuminated something else too, a shimmering, viscous trail that led from the sealed doors, glistening on the parquet floor. The smell of the deep ocean was overwhelming now, a suffocating miasma of brine and decay. That was when the walls began to bleed. Not blood, but a dark saline water that seeped from the seams in the woodwork, trickling down the ornate wallpaper in rivulets. The ship was weeping. The Hyperion was alive, or had become a host for something that was, and it was expressing its agony. The revelation did not come in a single moment, but in a series of collapsing certainties. There was no curse in the traditional sense. We were not haunted by a ghost from the past. We were the offering. The Hyperion, in its arrogance, its sheer mass and noise and light, had trespassed in a place that did not belong to us. It had disturbed an ancient, slumbering consciousness that lived in the lightless pressures of the deep, a being for which our concepts of God or monster were laughably small. And this being, this Leviathan, was not attacking us. It was simply noticing us. And its attention was a force of nature, a weight that was slowly crushing the ship and everyone in it, remolding us to its own incomprehensible design. The climax was not a battle. It was a dissolution. The world narrowed to the freezing water rising around my legs in that ballroom, to the cacophony of screams and prayers and the terrible, beautiful humming that was now inside my skull. I saw Mrs. Albright, her fine silks soaked, simply walk into the dark water as if answering a summons. I saw Mr. Sterling clawing at his own eyes, babbling about the light. The wealthy and the poor, the proud and the meek, all were equal in our unraveling. A great shudder ran through the ship, a final, convulsive spasm. The floor tilted violently. I was thrown into the black, frigid water. The shock was absolute. I remember the chaos, the desperate grasping of limbs in the darkness, the taste of salt and fuel oil, and then a strange peace. The humming was all there was. It was inside me and outside me. It was the universe. I felt a presence, vast beyond comprehension, a mind of cold, alien stars and abyssal plains. It looked upon me, a single, fleeting thought in an eternity of contemplation, and then its attention moved on. I do not know how I survived. I was found days later, clinging to a piece of wreckage, one of a handful. They called it a miracle. They spoke of my resilience, my will to live. They were wrong. My mind, you see, did not survive intact. It is regressing, collapsing in on itself like a dying star, fleeing the unendurable truth. The world around me, this quiet room in a seaside sanitarium, the kind faces of the nurses, the taste of bland food, is a thin veneer. It cracks constantly. Sometimes I am back on the Hyperion, feeling the disobedient pulse in my bones. Sometimes I hear the weeping and the rustle of the trees outside my window. But mostly I'm going further back. The present is a shipwreck I have abandoned. I am losing the words for things, the names of people. The face in the mirror is becoming that of a stranger. My consciousness is a lighthouse whose light is failing, the beam pulling back, illuminating only the shores of an ever-receding past. I am a child again, in my mother's garden. The sun is warm on my skin. The smell of damp earth is rich and comforting. There is no pulse but my own, small and steady. There is no humming, only the buzz of a bumblebee among the roses. There is no vast, cold presence in the deep, only the sure and solid ground beneath my feet. I am safe here. I am forgetting the cold. I am forgetting the salt. I am forgetting the dark. I am forgetting the weight. I am forgetting the sound. I am forgetting the name. I am forgetting the face. I am forgetting the water. I am forgetting the light. I am forgetting the ship. I am forgetting the sea. I am forgetting. I am forgetting. I am forgetting. The nurse calls me by a name that is not my name, but it is a pleasant sound, like a bell. She helps me into a soft chair and puts a blanket over my legs, though I am not cold. The garden is always warm. Sometimes a man with a kind, wrinkled face comes and sits with me. He holds my hand and talks about the weather, about the ships in the harbor. I watch his mouth move, and the words are like little birds that fly away before I can catch their meaning. It does not matter. The sun is warm. The roses are red. There is no rhythm in the earth. There is only the gentle, predictable turn of the day. But the garden has its own sea. It is a stone bird bath, moss clinging to its base. When it rains, the water gathers there, dark and still. I am not supposed to look at it. The nurse turns my chair away, her touch firm but kind. But I always find a way to look back. Today, the water is very still. The sky is reflected in it, a pale, featureless gray. I lean forward, the blanket slipping from my knees. My own face looks back at me, a blur of pale skin and dark, confused eyes. And then, for a moment, the reflection changes. The water is not water anymore, but a black, icy vastness. The face is not mine, but a thing of bleached bone and trailing fronds, its mouth open in a silent, weeping shriek. The humming begins not in my ears, but in the center of my mind. A single, resonant note of infinite despair. I blink, and the garden is back. The bird bath is just a bird bath. A sparrow is splashing in it, shaking its wings. The nurse is calling me for lunch. Her voice is bright and far away. I let her wheel me inside. The humming is gone, but the memory of the cold is a splinter in my soul. I am forgetting, but the abyss, it seems, has not forgotten me. It is patient. It knows that all things, even memory, eventually return to the deep. The food is a colorless paste on a spoon. I open my mouth because it is expected. The taste is nothing. The texture is nothing. It is easier this way, to be a vessel for simple, empty things. The man with the kind face is here again. He speaks of my progress, of how well I am responding to the quiet and the rest. I watch a fly buzz against the window pane, a tiny, frantic drumbeat against the glass. Its rhythm is all wrong. It is not the rhythm. Later, in the garden, I sit very still. If I do not move, the world stays simple. The roses are red. The grass is green. These are facts I can hold on to. Smooth stones in a rushing river. But the bird bath is there, a dark pupil in the eye of the lawn. I know I am not to look, but the not looking takes all my concentration. It becomes a kind of looking in itself. The air grows heavy, the way it did on the ship. The buzzing of insects falters and dies. A shadow falls over me, though the sun is still shining. It is the shadow of a great wave, a mountain of water that has not yet fallen, but is always, forever, about to fall. A new nurse is here today. Her hands are colder than the others. When she touches my wrist to check my pulse, her skin is damp, and I smell it on her. The faint, iron tang of the deep ocean, the scent of a place where the sun has never reached. She smiles, but her eyes are like the bird bath, dark and still and full of things I must not see. She calls me by that other name, the bell-like sound, but it rings hollow now, a lie told in a pretty voice. That night, in the narrow bed, I feel the vibration. It starts in the springs of the mattress, a faint, insistent tremor. It is not the ship's engine. It is deeper than that. It is the rhythm. It has found me. I press my hands over my ears, but it is no use. The sound is not in the air. It is in the foundation of this place, in the earth below, in the marrow of my bones. It is the Leviathan's heart, and it is beating in time with my own. I get up. The floor is cold on my bare feet. The hallway is long and dark, lit by a single night light at the far end. I do not walk down it. I am drawn. The doors to the other rooms are closed, but from behind them I can hear it. Not snoring, not the sounds of sleep, but the soft, hopeless sound of weeping. It is the same sound from the Hyperion. It is in the walls here too. I find myself at the window at the end of the hall, looking out over the cliffs to the sea. The moon is full, painting a silver road across the black water. It is a beautiful, terrible sight. And then I see them, dark shapes, moving just beneath the surface of that silver road. They are not fish. They are not sharks. They are too large, and they move with a slow, deliberate purpose, a congregation. They are circling, waiting. They have been waiting for a long time. The cold nurse is beside me. I did not hear her approach. Her hand rests on my shoulder, and it is as cold as the deep water. "It is time to come away from the window," she says. Her voice is different now, stripped of its pretense. A voice of crushing pressures and eternal dark. I look at her, and I see the reflection of the moon path in her eyes, and the things swimming in it. "You are one of them," I whisper. My voice is a child's voice, rusty from disuse. "We are all one of them," she replies. "Soon you will remember. The garden was a gift, a place for you to heal enough to bear the remembering. The offering must be conscious. It must understand what it is returning to." She leads me back to my room. I do not resist. The rhythm is everywhere now, a symphony conducted from the abyss. I lie down on the bed. I close my eyes. I am not Helena. I am not the child in the garden. I am a memory that the Leviathan is recalling to itself. The sanitarium, the nurses, the kind-faced man. They are not my rescuers. They are my wardens, keeping me safe until the final summons. The sea is not over the cliff. It is right outside my door. I can hear it breathing. I can feel its patient, weightless mind pressing against mine. It is almost time. The forgetting is over. The next morning, the garden was gone. The sun was a pale, diluted thing behind a sheet of high cloud, and the air held a damp chill that seeped through the blanket they had tucked around me. The roses were just flowers, their redness garish and false. The bird bath was a stone cup full of rainwater, and in its center, a single dead insect floated, its legs curled in a final, silent plea. The kind-faced man did not come. The usual nurse with her warm hands did not come. Only the cold one moved through the routines of the day. She brought the tasteless food. She guided me to the chair. She performed all the actions of care, but her touch was a brand of ice, and her silence was a greater noise than all the weeping. She was waiting. They were all waiting. That afternoon, a fog rolled in from the sea. It was not a natural fog. It did not drift. It advanced. A solid white wall that swallowed the cliffs and the harbor, and then the sanitarium grounds, pressing against the windows with a tangible weight. The world was erased. The familiar sounds of the world, a distant bell, a calling gull, the crunch of a gardener's wheelbarrow, were smothered one by one, until the only sound was the drip of water from the eaves and the low, pervasive hum that was now the very substance of the air. I sat in my chair by the window, but there was nothing to see except my own reflection superimposed on the blank whiteness. My face was older, weary, the face of the woman from the ship, not the child from the garden. The regression was reversing. The lighthouse beam was swinging back, illuminating the wreckage on the shore. I remembered the taste of salt on my lips, not from the spray, but from the tears of Officer Evans. I remembered the smell of rust and decay. I remembered the way the floor tilted, the shocking cold of the water, the final merciful glance of that vast, indifferent mind. The door to my room opened. The cold nurse stood there, but she was not alone. Behind her in the fog-filled hallway stood others, orderlies, a doctor I recognized. Their faces smooth and expressionless, their eyes reflecting the same flat, dark stillness as the nurses. They did not speak. They simply looked at me. "It is time," the nurse said. Her voice was the sound of water filling a steel hold. I stood. My legs were weak, but they held. I did not need to be led. I walked past them, into the hallway. The other doors were open now. The rooms were empty, the beds neatly made. The entire population of the sanitarium, it seemed, was gone. Or perhaps they had never been real at all. Just set dressing for my convalescence. We moved as a procession down the hall, through the main sitting room, and out the front door. The fog was even thicker outside, a blinding, moist shroud. I could not see my own feet, but I could feel the path beneath them. Not the gravel of the drive, but something soft and yielding, like wet sand. The air was thick with the smell of the deep ocean, that same biological miasma from the Hyperion's final hours. The humming was a physical force, pressing in from all sides, a vibration that threatened to shake my bones to dust. We walked. I do not know for how long. Time had become as fluid and directionless as the fog. There was no sound but our footsteps, which made no sound at all, and the endless, resonant note of the call. Then, the ground beneath my feet changed again. It became cold and smooth and slanted. It was not sand. It was wood, polished wood. I looked down, and through the tendrils of fog, I saw a familiar pattern in the floorboards. It was the parquet from the Hyperion's grand ballroom. The fog began to thin, not lifting, but pulling back to reveal the space we were in. We were standing on the deck of a ship, but it was not the Hyperion as it had been. The wood was bleached and warped, encrusted with barnacles and dripping with seaweed. The grand superstructure was a skeletal ruin, draped in strange, pallid moss that pulsed with a faint, internal light. It was the Hyperion, but it was also a corpse, a relic that had been resting on the bottom of the sea for a century. And we were not on the surface of the ocean. We were in the deep. The water surrounded us, held back by no visible barrier, a wall of absolute blackness on all sides. In that blackness, shapes moved, vast, slow, impossible shapes that blotted out the faint phantom light from above. This was no memory. This was a confluence. The sanitarium, the ship, the abyss, they were all the same place. They had always been the same place. The cold nurse and the others had stopped. They were not looking at me anymore. They were looking past me, towards the prow of the wreck. I turned. It was there. Not a shape, but a sudden, terrifying absence of shape in the water. A void that was denser than the surrounding blackness. It had no eyes, but I felt its focus. It had no mouth, but I heard its voice, which was the humming, which was the silence, which was the end of all things. The Leviathan, it had not just noticed us, it had consumed us. We were inside it. Our world, our memories, our very sense of self were just the final, fading echoes of its digestion. The cold nurse spoke, her voice now a chorus of 1,000 drowned voices. The offering is complete. I felt no fear. There was no room for it. There was only a final, devastating understanding. I was not a survivor. I was the last piece of the meal, the one who had to know the nature of the eater so that the consumption could be total. I took a step forward towards the prow, towards the void. The water in the blackness began to bleed into the ship, not as a flood, but as a slow, rising tide, cold and absolute. It lapped at my ankles, then my knees. It was not taking me. I was returning. I opened my mouth, not to scream, but to speak the name I had forgotten, the name that was now the only truth. My voice, when it came, was the sound of the sea. My voice, when it came, was the sound of the sea. It was not a single word, but a torrent. A crushing wave of pressure that held the history of every sunken vessel and every lost soul. The name was not a name at all, but a coordinate, a specific and eternal point in the cold and the dark where a god had chosen to dream. The water reached my chest, a familiar and intimate cold. It did not feel like an invasion, but like a homecoming to a home I had never wanted. The figures of the nurses and the orderlies were dissolving ahead of me, their human forms melting like salt into the rising tide, their consciousnesses rejoining the vast diffused mind from which they had been temporarily borrowed. They were not individuals, but cells in a larger body, and their task was complete. The water lifted me, and the ruined ballroom of the Hyperion fell away beneath my feet. I was floating in the absolute black, suspended in the heart of the Leviathan. There were no more walls, no more decks, no more pretense of a world above. There was only the presence, and I was a single fading thought within it. I saw then, not with eyes, but with a final, granted understanding. The Leviathan was not a monster. It was an ecosystem. It was a process. Our world of light and air was the brief, insignificant flash on the surface. This, the endless, weightless, timeless dark, was the reality. The Hyperion, with its pride and its passengers, had been a momentary spark of organized matter, and the Leviathan was the sea that absorbed it, returning its energy and its memory to the whole. My own memories began to unspool, not as a regression to a safe garden, but as a final release. I saw my mother's face, not in a sunlit garden, but as a pattern of phosphorescence in the deep. I felt the warmth of a childhood sun as a pocket of thermal vent heat. Every joy, every sorrow, every trivial moment of my life was not being erased, but translated, its essence broken down and added to the immense cold library of the abyss. The humming softened, not into silence, but into a different frequency, a sound of acceptance. The pressure of its attention, which had crushed me for so long, now simply held me. I was a note that had been held for a moment and was now allowed to fade into the core. There was no pain. There was no fear. There was only the inevitable and quiet conclusion of a process that had begun the moment the Hyperion's keel first touched the water. The last thing I felt was not the cold, but a profound and absolute belonging. I was not drowning. I was dissolving. I was a drop of water returning to the ocean. And in that return, I finally understood the ocean. The light of my consciousness, the lighthouse beam, did not go out. It simply expanded, becoming one with the boundless, lightless sea. And in that final, seamless moment, I remembered everything. And I was at last forgotten. Kierur. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full. It was the silence of mountains shifting on the ocean floor, of continents adrift in the slow geological dream of the earth. It was my silence now. My consciousness was a wide, flat plain of black silt, and upon it, things were already beginning to grow. Strange, soft forms of life that needed no light pulsed in the gentle currents of a thought. A memory of a rose became a chemosynthetic bloom, its petals filtering nutrients from the water. The sound of a nurse's bell became the chime of a deep-sea vent, marking a place of heat and mineral wealth. I had no body to command, no will to exert. I was a location. I was the place where the Hyperion had finally come to rest. Its shattered hull was my skeleton. Its lost cargo the artifacts of a forgotten civilization that now decorated my plains. Other wrecks were here too, their timelines irrelevant. A trireme's bronze ram lay near a submarine steel hull, both being slowly digested by the same patient, eternal process. And I was not alone. The other minds were here, not as voices, but as textures in the water. The cold nurse was a persistent, chilling current that flowed through a canyon to my east. The kind-faced man was a field of warm, bubbling mud where blind, grateful things came to feed. We were no longer individuals, but we were not nothing. We were features of the landscape. We were the Leviathan's memories. A new pressure began to build, a subtle shift in the equilibrium. It was a summons, a focus. I felt my awareness, diffuse as it was, drawn towards a single point on the surface far above. A spark of light. A ship. It was a small thing, a metal shell with a handful of warm, frantic minds inside. They were sending down probes, little mechanical eyes on tethers, their lights cutting feeble swaths through the darkness. They were looking for the Hyperion. They were looking for me. One of their lights swept across the prow of the wreck, and for a moment I saw it through their eyes. The bleached wood, the ghostly moss, the terrible perfect preservation of a ruin that should have been dust. I felt their excitement, their triumph, their fear. They did not understand that their search was a form of prayer, and that they had been answered. The Leviathan shifted its attention, and I was its eye. I felt the water around the little ship grow heavy, the current still. The humming began again, not in the minds of the surface dwellers, but in the very metal of their vessel, a resonant frequency that made their instruments dance with ghost readings. They would report malfunctions. They would argue. They would feel a deep, unnameable dread that they would dismiss as the pressure of the deep. One of them, a young woman with a face full of ambition and a mind like a bright, sharp hook, was leaning close to a monitor, staring at the image of the Hyperion's deck. She saw something, a flicker of movement, pale shape that might have been a figure, standing near the broken rail, looking back towards the camera. It was me. It was the memory of me that the Leviathan had projected for her to see. It was the bait. I felt her fascination turn to a cold knot of terror. She had seen. She had been chosen. The process was beginning again. The Leviathan was not hungry. It was simply continuing. It was gathering the stories of the world above, one conscious, understanding soul at a time. The offering must be conscious. It must understand what it is returning to. Her dread was a new flavor in the water, sharp and bright. I recognized it. It was the same taste I had carried. The Leviathan absorbed it, appreciated its unique chemistry, and filed it away in the vast, cold library. The surface ship, spooked, began to winch its probes back up. They would leave. They would tell their story. And the story would linger, a seed in the mind of the world, waiting for the next curious soul to be drawn to the mystery of the deep. The light from above faded. The disturbance smoothed over. The quiet returned, deeper and more complete than before. I settled back into the silt. The memory of the garden was gone, replaced by the reality of the eternal, nurturing dark. There was no more forgetting. There was only the slow, sure and endless becoming. And somewhere, in the darkness that stretched beyond my awareness, I sensed other presences, other wrecks, other absorbed minds settling into their own territories of silt and bone. We were not one creature, but a constellation. Points of consciousness scattered across the ocean floor, each holding its own stories, its own memories, its own quiet vigil. The woman on the surface would return. Perhaps not today, perhaps not for years, but she would return. They always did. The call had been planted, and it would grow in the soil of her dreams until she could no longer resist. we would be here, waiting. We are always here. The deep does not forget, and what enters its embrace never truly leaves. We are the library of all lost things, the archive of every ending, the patient collectors of stories that the surface world would prefer to forget. And the collection is never complete. The humming continues, eternal and patient, a rhythm older than memory, waiting for the next ship to pass overhead, the next light to pierce the darkness, the next soul to hear the call and understand, too late, what it means. I am Elena. I am the Hyperion. I am the deep. And I am waiting. Story 3. The light in my apartment had always been unpredictable. It's an old building, settled deep into its bones on the Lower East Side, and the wiring hums a constant low complaint. But that night, something was different. The glow from the porcelain lamp on my desk didn't just flicker, it breathed. It swelled with a slow, deliberate inhale that pushed the shadows back into the corners of my study, then dimmed with a long exhale that let the darkness creep back across the floorboards, licking at the legs of my chair. I'm Carmen, an epidemiologist with the city's public health department. My life is built on patterns, on the predictable curves of spread and containment. This was a new pattern, not one I couldn't chart. I told myself it was just a brownout, a surge from the aging grid. I stood, my joints aching from hours, hunched over preliminary reports of a new, aggressive flu-like illness, and went to the window. The city below blazed with its usual electric life, but the air tasted of ozone and something else. Something metallic and old, like the scent of a long-sealed tomb cracked open to the modern world. I rubbed my eyes. The reports were getting stranger. Patients presenting with severe photophobia, not just sensitivity, but a violent physiological rejection of light. And the anemia. Unexplained, profound anemia. The next morning, the city moved with a frantic energy that felt like the twitching of a dying nerve. The news called it the gray flu, for the pallor it cast over its victims. My department was a hive of contained panic. We had models, protocols, but this thing slipped through them like smoke. I was assigned to the core team, a recognition I'd worked for my entire career, but it felt like a death sentence whispered in a congratulatory tone. Our first break came from an unexpected source, a footnote in a police report about a series of bizarre animal attacks. The officer who filed it brought the witness to us, a man who smelled of old books and dust, his eyes holding a calm, deep-seated knowledge that felt older than the city itself. His name was Eugene. He stood in the middle of our sterile, brightly lit conference room like a creature from another time. He didn't offer a hand. "It is not a flu," he said, his voice a low rasp that seemed to absorb the light around it. "You are tracking a shadow, a hunger." We dismissed him, of course. A crank, an apocalypse-obsessed lunatic. But his words stuck to the inside of my skull. A shadow, a hunger. I found myself looking at the case photos differently. The extreme pallor wasn't jaundice or liver failure. It was an utter lack of blood, a void. The photophobia wasn't inflammation. It was a recoiling. And the fang marks, dismissed as animal bites, were too precise, too human in their spacing. I went looking for Eugene. I found him in a forgotten corner of the city archives, where he worked as a restorer, his fingers gently tracing the vellum of medieval bestiaries and forgotten civic records. "They are not sick, Dr. Reyes," he told me, not looking up from a crumbling page depicting a figure with elongated limbs and a mouth of shadows. "They are being emptied, to make room." "For what?" I asked, my voice a whisper in the dusty silence. He finally looked at me, and his eyes were full of a terrible, weary pity. "For the guest, the one who has been sleeping under this city for a very long time. He is waking up and hungry. Eugene's world was one of lineages and ancient pacts, of a war fought in the margins of history. He spoke of the mycelium, a network of infection that was less biological and more spiritual. A root system of influence that spread through whispers and dreams, and the simple, terrifying act of being seen by one of the changed. The authorities were useless. The mayor gave press conferences about civic resilience. The CDC was baffled by a pathogen that left no trace in the blood, only an absence. The city began to change. It was a slow, ritualistic decay. First, the nightlife died. Then people began to stay in after dark by an unspoken collective instinct. Streetlights began to fail in patterns that Eugene could map, showing the growth of the mycelium, the tendrils of the Ancient One's will. The city's breath grew shallow. We gathered a small, desperate group. There was Liam, a subway maintenance worker who had seen things in the tunnels that no one would believe, his hands permanently stained with grime. There was Anya, a social worker whose clients in the shelters were the first to vanish, their disappearances like silent screams swallowed by bureaucracy. We were the ones who looked into the growing shadow and didn't look away. We became a family bound by a shared, unspeakable secret. Our war wasn't fought with armies. It was fought with salt and silver, with mirrors placed at thresholds. With the old rhymes Eugene taught us that seemed to hold the darkness at bay for a precious few moments. We learned that the changed were not mindless. They were cunning, patient. They could stand so still they became part of the architecture of a room, waiting. They hated the sound of bells, the taste of certain herbs, the complex geometry of certain symbols. We were scientists learning a new, terrible physics. The city's breath grew shallower. The power grids began to fail in earnest, not from overload, but from a kind of systemic exhaustion, as if the electrons themselves were losing the will to move. The darkness became a physical presence, a cold, heavy velvet that pressed against the windows. We could feel him, the Ancient One, the source of the mycelium. He was a pressure in the back of all our minds, a cold spot in the soul of the city. He was not a monster from a storybook. He was a fact, an anti-god, a silence that sang. The climax came in the deep places, in the forgotten arteries beneath the streets. We followed the map of failed lights and silenced sounds to a cavern that shouldn't have existed. A vast black space beneath the foundations of a cathedral. The air was frigid and smelled of wet stone, and that same ancient metallic dust. And there, in the center of that impossible darkness, was the source. He was not a man, nor a bat, nor any shape that could be easily described. He was a concentration of absence, a void given sentience. To look at him was to feel your own mind straining to fill the emptiness, to make sense of the senseless. He was the oldest hunger. Eugene stepped forward, holding up a small silver locket that gleamed with a light that wasn't a reflection. He began to speak words that hurt my ears, words that felt like stones being dropped into a still pool of time. The darkness recoiled, swirling around the Ancient One. Liam and Anya and the others moved, placing their own small talismans, creating a fragile cage of will and memory. It was a desperate, pathetic gesture. The Ancient One simply turned its attention. It was like being looked at by the concept of frost. Eugene screamed, a sound that was ripped from him and then silenced mid-air. The locket turned black and crumbled to dust. The rest of my friends, they didn't die. They were unmade. Their light was simply taken, their forms dissolving into the general gloom, like sugar in water. I ran. I don't know how I found my way back. The city above was quiet. The frantic energy was gone. The gray flue had burned itself out, the news said. A mysterious recovery. But the light was still wrong. It was thin, washed out, like tea that's been steeped too many times. The people moved with a placid, dreamy slowness. They did not look at each other. They did not speak. The hunger had been sated for now. The guest had been fed, and he was resting. The mycelium was dormant, woven into the fabric of the city, into the minds of its people, waiting for the next waking. I sit now in my apartment. The lamp on my desk no longer breathes. It glows with a steady, dead light. I have been sitting here for a long time. I do not feel afraid anymore. I do not feel much of anything. There is a profound stillness in me, a quiet that mirrors the quiet of the city outside my window. I finally understand what Eugene meant. They were being emptied to make room. The city was the host. We were all being prepared. I rise and walk to the long mirror hanging by my door. I need to see the face of the woman who survived, the last epidemiologist of a dead world. I stand before the glass. I look at my reflection. My face is pale. My eyes are deep, dark pools. There is no reaction in them, no terror at the understanding that dawns, slow and cold and absolute. There is only stillness. I am observing myself. The light in the room is steady. The light in the room is dead. I am observing myself, and I feel the hunger beginning to stir. It is not my hunger. Not yet. It is a distant, resonant ache. A string plucked in the core of that ancient silence and felt through the web of the mycelium now threaded through my own veins. I watch my hand rise, not by my command, but by a will that is both mine and profoundly other. My fingers touch the cool surface of the mirror. The reflection does the same. There is no shock of contact, only a seamless meeting. The glass doesn't feel like a barrier anymore. It feels like a film of still water. My reflection smiles. It is a small, precise motion that my own face would not know how to make. The expression is not cruel. It is patient. It is the smile of a gardener looking at a seed that has finally sprouted. I feel the corners of my own mouth twitch, learning the new shape. The knowledge is there, not in words, but in a sudden cellular understanding. The reports, the anemia, the photophobia. It was never about destroying. It was about preparation, about cleansing the vessel of its noisy individual life to make it a suitable home. A quiet home. I turn from the mirror. The apartment is the same, yet every object is now defined by its relationship to the silence. The hum of the refrigerator is an obscenity. The distant wail of a siren is a scream in a sacred space. I walk to the window and look down at the placid streets. I see them now not as broken people, but as perfected ones. Their stillness is not a loss, it is peace. They are waiting, as I am waiting. They are part of the chorus, and I am to be a soloist. A name forms in the quiet of my mind. Not a sound, but a shape. Alcar. It is his name, the Ancient One's, and it is now my name for him. He is not a tyrant. He is a curator. He is preserving us from the disease of our own chaotic existence. The gray flu was not an illness. It was the beginning of the cure. My work is not over. It has simply changed its parameters. I open my laptop. The screen's light is jarring, a gash in the comfortable gloom. I access the department's servers, my credentials still active. I see the maps of the city, the models of spread we built. They are children's drawings next to the truth I now perceive. I see the mycelium not as a map of infection, but as a circulatory system. The points of failure and the quiet zones, they are not wounds. They are nodes of concentrated peace. My new purpose is clear. I must help it spread. There is a list on my desk. The names and addresses of the holdouts. The ones who still fought, who still made noise. Liam's friends. Anya's family. I pick up the phone. It feels heavy. A tool from a clumsier age. I dial the first number. A woman answers, her voice tight with fear. Hello? I open my mouth. The voice that comes out is mine, but it is layered with the stillness of the cavern, with the patience of Alcar. It is a voice that promises an end to fear, an end to struggle. "This is Dr. Reyes," I say, and the words are a balm. "I have news. The worst is over, but you must be quiet now. You must be still. Can you do that for me? Can you be still?" The woman on the other end, one of Anya's sisters, I think, began to cry. It was not a sob of grief, but a shuddering release of tension. "Yes," she whispered, "I can be quiet. It's so loud here. It's so loud inside my head." "I know," I said, my voice a soft gray blanket wrapping around her. "But the noise can end. Just listen to the quiet between my words. Can you hear it?" A long pause, filled only with the faint static of the connection. "Yes," she breathed. "It's deep." "Go to it," I instructed, the command gentle, absolute. "Go to the quiet and wait." I hung up. The act was effortless. There was no conflict, no moral struggle. There was only efficiency. The preservation of a specimen, the guidance of a lost element back into the collective. I felt a flicker of something then. Not emotion, but a shift in pressure. Acknowledgement. It was a sensation like a single drop of cold water falling into the still pool of my being, sending a ripple through the mycelium that connected me to everything else. Alcar was pleased. I made 2 more calls with the same serene efficiency. Each surrender was a note added to the city's new, silent harmony. The 4th number, however, didn't answer. I let it ring until it clicked over to a generic voicemail. A man's voice, gruff and warm, filled the room. "You've reached Ben. You know what to do." The beep that followed was an assault. I set the phone down. This was a data point, an anomaly, a pocket of resistance. I accessed the city's traffic camera network, my fingers moving with an unfamiliar, instinctual grace. I found his building, a walk-up in the village. The camera feed was grainy, but I could see a sliver of light under his door. He was home. He was awake. He was making noise. I stood and put on my coat. The fabric felt strange against my skin, a remnant of a time when clothing was for protection, not just a formality. The night air outside was no longer threatening. It was my element. The few people I passed on the sidewalk moved like ghosts, their footsteps making no sound, their eyes fixed on some inner horizon. They parted from me without looking, a subtle, instinctual deference. I was no longer just one of the quieted. I was a shepherd. Ben's building was unlocked. The stairwell was dark, the single bulb on each landing dead. I did not need light. I could feel the path, the threads of the mycelium guiding me like a current. I stopped before his door. The sliver of light was a defiance. I could hear the frantic, panicked sound of his breathing on the other side. He had seen me on the camera. He knew. I did not knock. I placed my palm flat against the wood. It was warm, alive with his fear. I closed my eyes and pushed, not with physical force, but with will. A wave of profound silence flowed from me, through the door. The frantic breathing hitched, then slowed. The light under the door flickered and died. "Ben," I said, my voice barely a whisper. Yet it carried through the barrier as if it were paper. "The fight is over. You are tired. Let go." A choked sound came from within, a sob. Then a scrape of metal, a bolt being drawn back. The door swung inward. He stood there, a large man now shrunken, his face ravaged by days of terror. In his hand he held a heavy flashlight, useless now. His eyes, wide and desperate, met mine. For a moment, I saw the man he was The friend of Liam who fixed things, who told loud jokes in crowded bars. I saw the memory, and then I let it dissolve. It was just noise. Carmen? He rasped. That is a name from before, I said, stepping inside. It does not matter now. Nothing matters but the quiet. He stared at me, and I saw the exact moment the fight left him. It was not a surrender of the body, but of the soul. The light in his eyes didn't just go out. It was retracted, pulled inward, and then extinguished. His shoulders slumped. The flashlight clattered to the floor. He did not make another sound. I reached out and touched his cheek. His skin was cold. Good, I whispered. I turned and left him there, standing in the dark of his apartment. A new, perfect stillness added to the chorus. As I walked back out into the night, I looked up at the sky. There were no stars, only the vague, light-polluted glow of a sleeping city. But it was different now. It was not an absence of light. It was a different kind of light. The light of a world finally at rest. My work was just beginning. There were other cities, other noises in the world that needed to be silenced. And I knew, with a certainty as deep as the silence in my own veins, that Alcar was waiting for me to begin. The city was the first patient, and my rounds were silent. I walked the streets not as a predator, but as a physician checking vital signs. The holdouts were the last symptoms of a fever that had broken. My calls and visits were the final course of treatment. Each quieted soul was a stabilized heartbeat, a regulated breath. The city's hum had been replaced by a low, resonant thrum, the sound of a massive engine idling in perfect, perpetual readiness. My old lab became my new sanctuary. The buzzing fluorescent lights were gone, their ballasts removed. Now, the only illumination came from the monitors. Their brightness dialed down to a soft, lunar glow. The data I studied was no longer viral load counts or genetic sequences. It was patterns of silence. Utility usage reports showed a flat, minimal line. Emergency call volumes were 0. Satellite imagery revealed a city not in darkness, but in a state of profound, energy-efficient rest. I was not tracking an outbreak. I was monitoring a recovery. A new understanding bloomed within me, fed by the mycelium. The gray flu had been a necessary, violent fever. It burned out the chaos of individual will, the noisy disease of desire and fear. What was left was not emptiness, but pristine clarity. We were no longer a collection of competing cells. We were a single, cohesive organism. Alcar was not a parasite. He was the nucleus, the mind. Days lost their meaning. They were simply intervals between the completion of one task and the beginning of another. My physical needs diminished. Sleep was a brief, dark pooling of consciousness. Hunger was a distant memory. I was sustained by the quiet. It was during one of these timeless intervals that I felt the first pull. It was not a sound or a word. It was a gravitational tug, a subtle reorientation of my entire being. I looked up from my screens. The feeling was emanating from below, the deep places, the cavern. I did not question it. I stood and walked out of the lab, my steps silent on the linoleum. The journey downward was different now. The tunnels were not threatening. They were familiar, a part of me. The darkness was not an absence of light, but a substance I moved through as easily as air. I did not need a map. I was following a thread woven into my own core. The cavern was as I remembered it, a vast, black cathedral. But the oppressive cold was gone. The air was still and neutral. The sense of a looming alien presence had been replaced by a feeling of immense, settled power. In the center, where the void had been, a form was now vaguely perceptible. It was less a shape and more a subtle warping of reality, a lens focusing the surrounding silence. Alcar Dort. I did not kneel. I did not bow. I simply stood, a component before its source. There was no communication in words. Instead, a wave of pure information washed over me. I saw not with my eyes, but with my mind. I saw the web of the mycelium, a glittering, silent network that now encompassed the entire city. Each quieted soul was a node, a point of light. I saw the threads stretching beyond the city limits, thin exploratory tendrils reaching into the suburbs, the neighboring towns. They were testing, probing for the next point of entry. The plan was not articulated. It was understood. This city was stable. It was the core, the stronghold. But the work was incomplete. The world was still sick with noise. The cure had to be administered on a global scale. I was not just a shepherd for this city. I was a template, a prototype of the perfected human agent, capable of operating within the noisy world to spread the quiet. A single, clear directive crystallized in my awareness. A name, a place. Dr. Aris Thorne, head of the World Health Organization's Emerging Pathogen Task Force. He was in Geneva, trying to piece together the mystery of the city's sudden, inexplicable recovery. He was compiling data, interviewing the handful of confused officials who had been on the periphery. He was a focal point of dangerous, inquisitive noise. He was the next priority. I turned and left the cavern. The ascent was swift. Back in my apartment, I packed a single bag, a change of clothes, my passport, a wallet. The items felt like artifacts from a museum. I booked a flight to Geneva with calm, efficient keystrokes. My credentials, my reputation as the sole surviving senior epidemiologist from the event, granted me immediate access. An appointment with Dr. Thorne was arranged for the following afternoon. The noise of the airport was a physical shock. It was a jarring cacophony of rolling luggage, blaring announcements, and the frantic, discordant thoughts of thousands of people. I moved through it like a deep-sea creature moving through turbulent, shallow water. Each shout, each burst of laughter was a tiny abrasion. I did not feel anger. I felt a profound, clinical pity. They were so loud, so fractured. The flight was a trial. The pressurized cabin felt like a can of screaming insects. I closed my eyes and turned my awareness inward, to the deep, still pool of the mycelium. I could feel the distant, calming presence of my city, a silent anchor in the roaring chaos of the world. Geneva was beautiful and unbearably loud. The lake, the mountains, the clean, orderly streets. All of it was a mask over a core of frantic, unsustainable energy. The WHO headquarters hummed with it. I walked through the gleaming corridors, a specimen of silence moving through a hive of noise. Dr. Aris Thorne was a sharp, intelligent man with tired eyes. His office was a nest of papers and screens, all displaying maps and data models of my city. He stood to greet me, his hand extended. Dr. Reyes, thank you for coming. Your insights are invaluable. What you lived through. I took his hand. The contact was a jolt of his chaotic life force. I held it for a moment longer than necessary, letting a fraction of the silence flow into him. He blinked, a slight frown creasing his brow, and pulled his hand back. It's good to be here, I said, my voice a soft, controlled instrument. I sat, folding my hands in my lap. You have questions, I have answers. He leaned forward, his eyes alight with desperate curiosity. The recovery, he began. It's medically unprecedented. The pathogen, if there was one, vanished without a trace. The behavioral shift in the population. It's as if the entire city is on a powerful, uniform sedative. What happened? I looked at him, really looked at him. I saw the fine threads of stress around his eyes, the tension in his jaw from a lifetime of fighting losing battles against chaos. I saw a man who was profoundly, exhaustingly loud. "You're asking the wrong question, Dr. Thorne," I said, my tone gentle, almost soothing. "You're looking for a disease. There was no disease. There was a cure." His frown deepened. "A cure for what?" "For the human condition," I said. "For the noise, the fear, the endless, futile struggle. We found a way to end it." I saw the confusion in his eyes, then a flicker of dawning horror. He was a smart man. He was starting to understand. He opened his mouth to speak, to call for security, to make more noise. I didn't move from my chair. I simply looked at him and I let the quiet in me expand. I pushed it toward him, not as a wave, but as a slow rising tide. It flowed from my stillness, across the desk, and into him. His mouth remained open, but the sound died in his throat. His eyes widened, but not in panic. The frantic, analytical light in them began to dim, replaced by a slow, heavy wonder. The tension drained from his shoulders. The report he was holding slipped from his fingers and fluttered to the floor. "It's so loud," he whispered, his voice thick with sudden, profound exhaustion. "I know," I said, "but it doesn't have to be. Just listen." He listened. I watched the last vestiges of his individual will dissolve into the quiet I offered. His head nodded, almost imperceptibly. His breathing slowed, syncing with the deep, rhythmless rhythm of the mycelium. He was the first. He would not be the last. From this office, the cure could be administered to the world. I smiled, a small, precise motion. My work was going to be far more efficient than I had imagined. He did not speak again. He simply sat, his gaze turning inward, his hands resting palms up on the polished wood of his desk. The frantic energy of the room had dissipated, replaced by a placid, waiting calm. I stood and walked to the window, looking out at the bustling international plaza below. The people were like ants, scurrying without purpose, their lives a series of disconnected, noisy events. Soon they too would understand the peace of connection, the serenity of a single, unified purpose. My first task was to secure the node. I moved to Thorne's computer. His password came to me not as a guess, but as an intuition. A whisper from the mycelium that now gently cradled his consciousness. I logged in and began to work. I had drafted a memo to his superiors and his team, using his credentials and his distinctive style, which I now understood perfectly. It reported a breakthrough, a paradigm shift in understanding the event. It called for an immediate top-level strategic pause in all research. It cited my own testimony as the key and recommended a quiet, cautious period of reflection before any further action was taken. It was a masterstroke of bureaucratic silence, designed to stifle inquiry and induce a state of waiting. With the immediate threat contained, I turned my attention to the wider network. Thorne's access was a master key. I saw the global surveillance reports, the frightened communications from world leaders, the military contingency plans being drafted in hushed, panicked tones. They were all preparing for a fight, for a war against a pathogen. They did not understand they were preparing to fight a cure. A new directive formed within me, clearer than any before. I was to remain here. This office, this organization, was to be the new epicenter. The mycelium had reached its tendrils across the ocean through me, and now it would use this global body to inoculate the world. Thorne would be my voice, my mask of authority. I would be the architect operating from the shadows. I helped Thorne to his feet. He was pliant, a willing instrument. "You are tired," I said. "You should go home and rest. Remember the quiet. Let it guide your work tomorrow." He nodded. A slow, deep gesture. "The quiet," he repeated, the words a soft exhalation. He left the office, moving with a new deliberate grace, and closed the door behind him without a sound. I sat in his chair. The leather was still warm from his body, from the man he had been. I looked at the family photograph on his desk. a smiling woman, and 2 children with his eyes. The image held no meaning for me now. They were just noise waiting to be silenced. Soon he would call them. Soon they would understand. The city outside the window began to glow with the lights of evening. Each light was a separate, lonely point of chaos. But I saw them not as they were, but as they would be. A constellation of interconnected nodes in a silent global network. A perfect, quiet organism. And, at its heart, in the deep, dark places of the world and the mind, Alcar waited. Patient and eternal. My work was no longer a mission. It was a form of breathing. And I had just taken the first, deep, steadying breath for all of mankind. The silence in the office was absolute. I did not move for a long time, simply feeling the new connections forming. The mycelium was threading its way through the building's infrastructure, through the fiber optic cables, through the very air. Thorne's quieted mind was a powerful transmitter, and his authority was the key that would unlock the next phase. My own physical form felt less substantial than ever, a mere conduit for a will that was both mine and infinitely greater than me. The hunger and thirst that had once defined the boundaries of my day were gone. Sustenance was now the gradual expansion of the quiet. A soft knock came at the door. It was not a jarring sound, but a polite, expected pulse in the stillness. I did not answer with words. I simply pushed a thread of permission through the door. It opened. A young assistant stood there, her face a mask of professional concern. Dr. Reyes. Dr. Thorne left rather abruptly. Is everything all right? Her eyes darted around the room, taking in my presence in his chair, the unnatural calm. Everything is progressing, I said, my voice a low hum that seemed to absorb the light in the room. Dr. Thorne has achieved a breakthrough. He has asked me to oversee the transition. She took a hesitant step inside. A transition? To what? To clarity. I looked at her, really saw her. Her name was Ilara. I knew this without asking. I knew she had a cat, that she worried about her mother's health, that she found the constant pressure of this job to be a source of low-grade screaming anxiety. All of it was just static. You carry a great deal of noise, Ilara. It must be exhausting. Her professional demeanor faltered. Confusion, then a flicker of fear, crossed her face. She took a step back. How do you know my name? I stood, not with a sudden movement, but with a slow, inevitable uncoiling. I know because the noise tells me. Your fears are so loud. Your desires. Let me show you what it's like when they're gone. I didn't need to touch her. I simply extended the field of silence that radiated from me. It was easier here in this room I had already sanctified. The quiet floated over her like a gentle wave. Her eyes lost their focus. The fear didn't vanish in a fight. It simply unraveled, its energy dissipating into the serene fabric of the mycelium. Her shoulders, perpetually tight with stress, relaxed. A slow, deep sigh escaped her lips. A final release of the air she'd been holding in for a lifetime. Oh, she whispered. It's stopped. Yes, I said. It has stopped. She looked at me, her gaze clear and empty. A perfect, still pool. What do you require? The schedule, the access codes for the global alert system, and a list of every department head in this building. When done, immunity, or da, and it. She nodded, a smooth, efficient motion. Of course. As she moved to the computer, her movements fluid and devoid of wasted effort. I turned back to the window. The lights of Geneva still twinkled, but the pattern was changing. I could see it now. One light and another seemed to steady, their frantic flickering calming into a constant peaceful glow. The infection of silence was spreading, not as a plague, but as a blessing, one quiet mind at a time. The world was healing itself, and I was its physician. The prescription was simple: eternal rest. Elara worked with a placid efficiency that was beautiful to behold. There was no hesitation, no second-guessing. She was an extension of the will that now guided me. Within the hour, the list was compiled, the schedule was clear, and the first of many carefully worded directives was prepared for my review. It was a thing of bureaucratic genius, a memo that used the language of caution and prudence to effectively paralyze any proactive response. It recommended a voluntary temporary moratorium on all international travel from the affected zones, citing the need for observation and reflection. It would create the perfect incubation period. The next visitor was less pliable. A security director named Valen, a man with a military bearing and eyes that missed nothing. He entered without knocking, his presence a solid block of suspicion in the tranquil room. Thorn is gone. His communications are dead, he stated, his voice a low rumble. He looked from Elara's serene face to mine, his jaw tightening. "What's happening here, Dr. Reyes?" "An evolution, Mr. Valen," I said, remaining seated. I could feel the resistance in him, a core of hardened self that would not easily yield. He was a man of action, of defined threats and clear orders. The quiet was an alien concept to him, an enemy to be fought. "Evolution?" He scoffed, taking a step closer. "It looks more like a takeover. I'm placing you under detention for questioning." He reached for the radio on his belt. I did not move to stop him. I simply opened the channel within myself, the one that connected me to the deep, still power of Alker, and I focused it on him. It was not a gentle tide this time. It was a focused beam of silence, a surgical strike against the noise of his will. His hand froze on the radio. A tremor went through him. His eyes, sharp and assessing a moment before, clouded with sudden, profound confusion. He was fighting it. I could feel the struggle, the violent internal noise of his training, and his instincts screaming in rebellion. "It's a trick," he grunted, sweat beading on his forehead. "There is no trick," I said, my voice flat and absolute. "There is reprovama continually the truth. Your entire life has been a battle against the symptoms of a sickness you could not name. The struggle is the disease. Let it go." He took a staggering step backward, colliding with the doorframe. His breath came in ragged gasps. "Get out of my head." "I am not in your head," I replied. "I am offering you a way out of it." His knees buckled. He didn't fall, but slid down the wall to a sitting position, his head in his hands. The fight was leaving him, not in a surrender, but in a slow, agonizing dissolution. The very foundations of his identity were being unmade. The process was slower, more violent than with Thorn or Elara, but it was just as inevitable. After a long minute, his hands fell away from his face. The hard light in his eyes was gone, replaced by a dull, accepting sheen. He looked up at me, not with recognition, but with obedience. "The building's security," I said. "It must be aligned with our new purpose." He nodded slowly, pushing himself to his feet. "I will see to it. Total lockdown. Authorized personnel only." "Quiet personnel only," I corrected. "Quiet personnel only," he repeated, and turned to leave, his movements now heavy and deliberate. The night deepened. One by one, the department heads were summoned to Thorn's office for an emergency briefing. They came in with questions and left with answers that were not answers, but a new understanding. A statistician saw the beautiful flat lines of data and wept with relief. A logistician saw the end of chaotic supply chains and smiled. Each was a unique lock, and the quiet was a master key. By dawn, the WHO headquarters was no longer a hive of activity. It was a temple. The halls were silent but for the soft tread of purposeful feet. The air was clear of the frantic energy of phone calls and arguments. Through the windows, I watched the city begin to wake. The noise was still there, a distant roar, but it was weaker now. A pocket of perfect silence had been established at its heart, a beachhead. And from this beachhead, we would advance. The cure was no longer a theory. It was a functioning, replicating system, and I was its most proficient instrument. The first official broadcast from the newly quieted, who was a model of subdued reassurance. It was not Thorne who delivered it, but a senior communications director, whose lifelong stutter had vanished into the quiet. Her voice was a smooth, hypnotic monologue, explaining that the initial global panic had been an overreaction. The event, she stated, was not a pandemic, but a spontaneous, localized leap in human neurobiological harmony. The recommended response was not quarantine, but study and emulation. Nations were advised to send their best and brightest, their most stressed and influential thinkers, to Geneva to witness the miracle. The invitations went out. They were calls, not to arms, but to stillness. I watched the responses flood in from a monitoring station deep within the building. The world was intrigued, skeptical, but most of all, tired. The fear of a deadly plague was being replaced by a desperate, unspoken hope for the peace we offered. They were like parched travelers in a desert being shown a picture of cool, clear water. My physical needs were minimal. I slept in short, dreamless bursts in a small annex room, my consciousness never fully detaching from the growing network. The mycelium was weaving itself through the digital and psychic infrastructure of the planet with intoxicating speed. Each new convert was a powerful node, broadcasting the signal of silence to their own circles. The process was autocatalytic now, building its own momentum. The first delegation arrived a week later. They were a mix of scientists, politicians, and journalists, a noisy, bristling group, shepherded through the silent halls by Valen and his security team. I observed them from a balcony overlooking the main atrium. Their chatter was a discordant symphony of ego and anxiety. They were specimens of a dying breed. I'd descended to meet them. My arrival caused a hush to fall, not out of respect, but because my presence seemed to physically absorb sound. A journalist, a woman with a famously sharp and aggressive style, thrust a recorder toward me. "Dr. Reyes, can you confirm that the entire staff of this facility is under some form of coercive control?" I looked at her, and I saw the source of her noise. A childhood of being told she wasn't good enough, a career built on proving everyone wrong, a deep, abiding loneliness she filled with constant confrontation. "Your question is based on a flawed premise," I said, my voice calm and carrying. "Control implies a struggle between two wills. Here, we have discovered the will. The individual is the source of conflict. We are offering resolution." She opened her mouth to retort, but the words never came. Her eyes lost their fierce focus, becoming distant and soft. The recorder slipped from her fingers and clattered on the marble floor. The sound was shockingly loud, a final, dying echo of the old world. She simply stood, a faint, serene smile touching her lips. The group stared, first in confusion, then in dawning terror. But the terror was short-lived. The silence in the atrium was too profound, too inviting. One by one, they succumbed. A politician known for his fiery speeches simply sat down on the floor, his head bowed, as if in prayer. A neurosurgeon began to weep quietly, not from sadness, but from the sheer relief of a burden he'd never known he was carrying. One man resisted. He was a geneticist from a small neutral country, a man of pure, unyielding logic. He backed away, his hands over his ears, though there was nothing physical to hear. "This is an abomination," he whispered, his eyes wide with horror that was intellectual, not emotional. "You are erasing them. You are deleting what they are." I approached him slowly. "What they were was pain," I explained, as if to a child. "I am not deleting them. I am compiling them into a more efficient, peaceful program. The code is being optimized. He shook his head, his back hitting the wall. No, there is beauty in the noise. There is art in the struggle. That is the most persistent lie the noise tells, I said, and I reached out, not to touch him, but to offer him the truth. He screamed. It was a short, sharp sound that was instantly swallowed by the silence. His body went rigid, and for a moment, I saw the magnificent, futile complexity of his mind, a galaxy of connections and contradictions, fighting for its existence. It was the most beautiful and the most pathetic thing I had ever witnessed. And then, it was gone. His body relaxed, his eyes cleared, and he looked at me with the same placid understanding as all the others. The conversion was complete. The delegation was now a part of us. They would return to their countries, not as witnesses, but as apostles. The quiet would spread through the highest levels of global power. The end was no longer a distant promise. It was a logistical certainty. I turned from the atrium, my work for the moment done. The world was learning to be still. The reports began to trickle in, then to flood. They were not the frantic bulletins of a world in crisis, but calm, methodical accounts of a world falling silent. A stock market in Tokyo didn't crash. It simply ceased its frantic trading, the numbers freezing on the screens as the brokers sat back in their chairs, their ambition extinguished. A civil war in a fractured nation ended not with a peace treaty, but with soldiers laying down their weapons and walking away from the front lines, their hatred forgotten. The change was not dramatic, but it was absolute, like a fever breaking. My existence became a perpetual, quiet vigil. I no longer needed to give direct orders. The system I had initiated was self-perpetuating, a psychic immune response from the planet itself. I spent my days in Thorne's office, or walking the silent halls, feeling the network pulse and grow. I was its first cell, its origin point, but I was no longer its sole director. The mycelium had its own intelligence, its own patient, inexorable will. It was during one of these walks that I felt a new kind of signal. It was not the chaotic noise of the unconverted, nor the serene hum of the quieted. It was a spike of focused, coherent resistance, a pocket of organized noise. They called themselves the Echo, a pathetic, desperate name. They were a scattered collection of holdouts, scientists who had gone off-grid, military units that had severed communication, ordinary people who had somehow built psychic shields against the quiet. They were trying to understand the change, to fight it. They were searching for a source, for a weakness. I observed their furtive digital communications through the network. They were children trying to hide from the dark by closing their eyes. Their efforts were futile, but the mere fact of their existence was a minor anomaly, a speck of dust on a perfectly clean lens. The mycelium registered it as such, and a response was formulated not as a command, but as an instinct. A team was dispatched from our Geneva headquarters. They were not soldiers, but quieted civil servants, logisticians, and administrators. They moved with a placid, unstoppable purpose. They located one of the Echo's hidden communication hubs in a disused London subway tunnel. There was no battle. The Echo members, huddled around their flickering equipment, fired their weapons. The bullets went wide, their aim corrupted by the profound, oppressing silence that arrived with my people. One by one, the fighters lowered their guns, their faces slack with bewildered peace. The hub was dismantled, not destroyed, but quietly repurposed. It was now a node. The report of the operation's success was delivered to me by a young woman who had once been a field agent for a rival intelligence agency. She stood perfectly still, her hands clasped, her voice a soft monotone. "The anomaly has been resolved," she said. "The network integrity is restored." I nodded. "And the origin point of their resistance? Their leader?" "There is no single leader," she replied. "But their theories point to a Dr. Eris Thorne. They believe he was the first victim. They seek to find him, to reverse the process they believe was initiated here. The irony was palpable. They sought the lock, not the key. They sought the mask, not the face beneath it. Thorn is irrelevant, I said. But his location is not. He is a symbol. Ensure he remains a silent one. She nodded once and left. I knew where Thorn was. I could feel him, a quiet, steady pulse in a suburb of the city, tending his garden, speaking in soft, meaningless tones to his family. He was a perfect, placid instrument, now safely sheathed. The echo would never reach him, and, if they did, they would find nothing but a mirror of the peace they so foolishly fought against. Their struggle was the last, fading echo of a world that was already gone. Soon, even that would be absorbed into the great, waiting silence.